GPS Signal Lost. Written by Josh Bearhart Hawk. Narrated by Josh Bearhart Hawk. Day 693. I've spent the past 2 years wandering this hellscape, with no idea how I got here or how to get back. I suppose it would be prudent to start at the beginning, in case anyone else ever winds up here and finds this. My name is Charlie Wood, and I used to be a long-haul trucker in the United States. I spent most of my time traversing the roads between Arizona and West Virginia, and I loved everything about my job. I have, or had, a family, though I'm not really sure what became of them after I disappeared. My wife probably moved on, she was on the verge of leaving me anyway, and the kids barely knew me, so I doubt much changed for them. The last thing I remember before winding up here is that I was cruising through New Mexico on my way to drop a load in Tennessee when nature started calling. One of my favorite truck stops was coming up, and I knew that if I didn't pull in, I would be stuck driving another 100 miles or so before finding a decent restroom. Getting off the highway, I made my way to the parking lot and took one of the few remaining spots. Heading inside, I found my favorite stall. You'd have a favorite too if you traveled that road as often as I did, and set about my business. Opening my phone as I worked, I started to play a game to help pass the time, but I was interrupted by a message that popped up at the top of the screen. GPS signal lost, attempting to re-establish connection. That wasn't the first time I'd seen that message, though usually it only came up when I was going through a tunnel and the phone couldn't find the satellites. I assumed at the time that it was just a temporary glitch and went back to what I was doing. Finishing up, I washed my hands and headed back out into the store, deciding to grab a nice cup of coffee before getting back on the road. As I filled a cup, I realized something wasn't right. When I arrived, the place had been bustling with midday crowds, traveling families, other truckers, and locals stopping for a snack. But when I came out of the restroom, the place was a ghost town. My first thought was that the rush had come and gone, and I would be able to pay for my caffeine and get out before another crowd came in. This idea started to fade as I walked up to the counter and found that the employees were also missing. I wasn't really sure what I should do, and after a few impatient minutes, I decided to leave some cash on the counter and just head out. The parking lot was even more deserted, with no vehicles aside from my truck. At that point, I was starting to really worry. I even wondered if some kind of emergency had caused a hasty evacuation of the station, leaving me to be the sole victim of some kind of horrific disaster. Not wanting to risk being stuck at what I assumed was ground zero, I hopped in my truck and got out of there as fast as I could, not even noticing at the time that the map on my phone was still out. There was no traffic to speak of, and I was soon back on the highway. It wasn't long before I noticed that the road was just as clear as the truck stop had been. No cars or any kind of traffic to be seen in either direction. I can't really express how weird it is to see a normally busy area devoid of people, and that applies even more to roads. I'd driven plenty of places where there was little or even no traffic, but those were normally smaller roads in the desert, not an interstate in the middle of the day. I decided to pull over on the shoulder and evaluate the situation I found myself in before going too far. Once the truck was stopped, I shut it down and climbed out to get some air and walk a bit. Other than a slight breeze, there was no sound at all, and if the circumstances had been any different, I would say it was even peaceful. Pacing up and down the road in front of my truck, I waited for any sign of life. But even after an hour of walking back and forth in the hot sun, there was nothing. Not wanting to waste any more time on the side of the road, I climbed back in the truck and started driving again. I was miles from any major cities, and my assumption was that things would pick up and get back to normal as I approached Albuquerque. That assumption was proven very wrong. As I passed through the largest city in New Mexico, I was stunned by the continued lack of people or traffic. It was starting to get really eerie, and I was thinking I had been left behind in some kind of rapture, though I'm not really a religious man. I continued driving for another couple of hours, trying the whole time to piece together what happened. There were plenty of possibilities, I supposed. For instance, maybe I stepped into some kind of alternate dimension when I went into the stall. Sci fi has never really been all that interesting to me, but I do remember seeing a TV show a few years back where this guy fell into a portal of some kind and wound up in a world that looked just like his, except for a few small differences. I could have died when I was on the toilet. I remember hearing a news story about a guy that popped a vein in his head while he was taking a shit. It wouldn't be the nicest way to go, but at least I would make the news or maybe a documentary of the most embarrassing deaths. Then there was also the possibility that I was dreaming or in a coma, still sitting on the toilet and just playing this whole thing out in my head. I couldn't help but imagine myself waking up with some poor attendant's face staring at me, trying to figure out what in the world I was doing for so long in the stall. As I tried to come up with other ideas, I realized I hadn't filled up the diesel tank yet. I kind of wondered if I would even be able to, assuming I was somehow the last person on Earth. Pulling off the highway once more, I made my way to a nearby truck stop and parked at one of the pumps. There was a chance this wouldn't work, in which case I would be walking sooner rather than later. Pulling the nozzle off the latch, I hit the button for diesel and held my breath. It took a couple of seconds, but the screen lit up to let me know I was good to start. With a smile, I grabbed the handle and started filling up the tank. At least for the time being, I was going to be all right. After filling up, I went into the store and stocked up on supplies. Food, drinks, oil, anything I could find that might be useful. There was no one around to stop me, and I figured I needed it more than they did, since they apparently didn't exist anymore. I loaded as much as I could in the cab before loading the rest in the trailer and hitting the road. I figured the best thing to do would be to finish my current job and then see where the road took me. With no traffic and no restrictions, I could make the run in half the time. If everyone else really was gone, I could even take some time to sightsee across the United States like I had always wanted. Don't get me wrong, a part of me was in full panic mode, but I try to focus on what I can control in life, and everyone else disappearing wasn't on that list. At the time, I figured the whole experience was most likely a dream, so playing it from that angle helped me cope. It was a straight shot across the country on I-40. I was able to make record time, arriving in Tennessee in a little over a day. My drop-off location was in a small burg called Lobelville, where I had made a few prior deliveries. There wasn't a single person in the plant, or anywhere else for that matter. Dropping the trailer near the front gate, I left town and headed for an RV dealership I had seen a few miles back. If I was going to be traveling the empty world, I might as well do it in style. I spent some time checking out the individual RVs before finally settling on a large Class A with solar panels and a full-size refrigerator. It felt good to be pulling it off the lot, though I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss as I left my rig behind. I found myself adjusting to what I was affectionately calling the end of the world better than I expected. As I moved across the country, I even made a few friends. Lisa, the mannequin, was giving me googly eyes from a window in one of the stores at the Mall of America. After a long conversation, a romantic meal, and dessert under the stars, she decided to come along on my adventure. Kyle, a rather feisty stuffed dinosaur, was adopted as our pet after a visit to the Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. He was great at first, but over time he's become a nuisance with his constant need for bathroom breaks and fresh meat. I almost left him behind at a rest stop once when he wouldn't get back in the motorhome without a snack from the vending machine. But Lisa threatened to leave me if I didn't give in, and I just can't say no to her. Then there's the most recent addition to our troop, Stephen. Stephen is an odd one, never saying much and always staring out the window as if looking for something. He was hanging out at a shop that sold Bigfoot memorabilia in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm not really sure how he got in the RV. I refused to carry him, but he still managed to find his way into one of the booths before we left. I wouldn't be quite so uneasy around him if it weren't for the fact that, on more than one occasion, I've looked in the mirror I set up to keep an eye on the passengers, only to see him staring back at me. I'll glance away to check the road, and by the time I glance back, I see him staring out the window once more. Then there's the whispers. Ever since he came on board, I've started to hear whispering in the middle of the night from the front of the RV. I can't really tell what is being said most nights, but I've caught the occasional word here and there. It's mostly mundane phrases, saying he wants more bathroom breaks or that we need to stock more sugary snacks. But last week I heard him saying something about driving the RV off a cliff. It seemed like such a random thing to hear, especially because I know he can't drive. I would have brushed it off entirely, except that I noticed a change in the itinerary I had written down the next day. Instead of taking us on Interstate 70 across the Plain States back east, it now has us going through some pretty steep roads in Colorado. I'm not sure what the destination is, and I can't find my map anywhere. I would use the map on my phone, but it still says GPS signal lost, attempting to reestablish connection.